Mexico inaugurated the century of revolution, and it also, in some ways, inaugurated the end of the century's turn to neoliberalism. So start with the Mexican Revolution. It's a multi-sided fight among factions that breaks out at the end of the liberal period. Lasts from about 1910 to 1920. By the time it's over, the old regime has been definitively, decisively destroyed. The hacienda system has been upended. The power of the old ruling elites has been crushed and vanquished. This is a successful revolution by almost any measure of the term. By the 1930s, the administration of Cárdenas has begun a process of radically redistributing land. For a time, they take their cues from Soviet experiments in state farms. State farms were widely applied here in Mexico. I'm recording this from Mexico. And the net results of destroying the old regime and redistributing resources, nationalizing the subsoil, including petroleum and gas and so on, was a good 35-year run of continuous economic growth, the Mexican miracle. Of course, the miracle was not without its blemishes, and those blemishes became increasingly obvious and increasingly onerous as time went by. The ruling party was a clique. It was a closed and centralist and democratic appearing, but not really democratic party. And it also became increasingly corrupt over time. So you have one of those 20th century key stories about revolutions betrayed, if you want to tell it that way. And it seems a very plausible way of telling the story, after all. By 1968, you have the Tlatelolco massacre in Mexico City. You have a series of brutal, repressive campaigns against the New Left. And you have the hardening of a kleptocratic regime who by the 1980s began to administer neoliberal reforms, shock therapies, expansive privatization, and so on, in no small part at the prodding of the US and the international lending agencies. So this too seems to me to be an important part of the history of what happens in the 20th century, and there's probably no more telling story than the story of Carlos Slim, who acquired Telmex, the Mexican phone company, for a song, literally paid nothing out of pocket, was awarded the contract because he was a political crony, and then proceeded to go on to build the largest fortune at the time. For several years, he was the richest man in the world as a result of digging and gouging and expanding his fortune. So there's my nomination. In Mexico, you have a front row seat to the 20th century. It starts with a revolution. It continues on with the consolidation of a successful revolution by almost any count. The story goes on to tell about the revolution ultimately betrayed, and perhaps the ultimate betrayal of the revolution comes in the 80s and the 90s with the very thoroughgoing neoliberalization of policies here.